What would you do if your own son saw you as nothing more than a signature on a business deal? When Trevor got married, I sat in the back row like a stranger at my own child's wedding. No speech, no recognition, just polite nods and stolen glances. But what Trevor didn't know was that I held the key to 1,700 acres of prime Oregon land, and a letter from his father that would change everything. What happened next didn't just shock my son, it shocked me too. And if you think you know how this ends, trust me, you don't. The day after the wedding, I woke up still wearing the same earrings I had carefully chosen. Small silver ones, the kind Trevor used to tug at when he was a toddler in church. I kept them on, maybe out of habit, or maybe because taking them off would feel like admitting the day before had actually happened. Later that afternoon, I checked my phone. Still no message from Trevor. No thank you. No follow-up. But there was a group photo posted online. Blair's family beaming, their friends framed perfectly, and Trevor standing in the center like he belonged there his whole life. I searched the faces. I wasn't in the picture. I hadn't even known it was taken. That evening, a small envelope was slid through the mail slot of my apartment. No return address, but the handwriting was his. Inside was a folded card and a dinner invitation. It read, like something written by someone in public relations. Polite, efficient, emotionally vacant. He and Blair wanted to take me out to dinner. They had something they wanted to share. I stared at the words for a long time. Not a single mention of love or appreciation. Just an ask and a reservation. I went anyway. The restaurant was one of those upscale places that looked like a barn but charged like a yacht. The host recognized them, treated them like regulars. Blair was already seated, holding a glass of sparkling water like it was something important. Trevor stood when I approached, kissed my cheek lightly, then sat down without pulling out my chair. We ordered small plates. Locally sourced, fancy names I didn't recognize. I barely touched mine. Trevor did most of the talking. He started with a long speech about how the world was changing, how land should be used more efficiently, how he and Blair had a vision. He said they wanted to create a wellness retreat, a modern sanctuary, a place where nature met innovation, and then he brought out the folder. Inside was a proposal. Detailed charts, business plans, color-coded tabs. At the back, a signature page. My name printed neatly under the line. He smiled like he'd done me a favor. Said the property would be managed in my name but only on paper. Said it would ease the paperwork in the long run. Blair nodded, her voice soft and practiced. She said this was about legacy, that Trevor and I could build something together. Something lasting, but she didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at the folder. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just sat there, listening to my son speak in polished sentences that didn't sound like him, watching him sell me something I never asked for. The waitress came by, refilled my glass. I looked at the ice floating in the water. Cold, clear, slowly disappearing, just like everything else. The morning after that dinner, I folded the proposal back into its folder and tucked it under a stack of gardening catalogs I hadn't opened in months. I left the envelope from Trevor inside, untouched. My apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the low creak of the baseboard heater coming to life. I sat at the kitchen table for a long while, sipping coffee that had gone cold before I remembered to drink it. There was no decision yet. I hadn't called Trevor. He hadn't followed up. But something had shifted. Not in the folder. In me. That afternoon, I took a walk to clear my head. Ended up passing by the old feed store I hadn't stepped into in years. They were selling seed packets out front again. It reminded me of the early years, before the arguments, before the silence. When Trevor used to run between rows of hay bales, chasing kittens while his father stacked feed. When he used to ask about the names of trees, and I had answers. I went home, sat on the edge of the bed, and pulled out the key I'd kept on my necklace chain. It was small and brass and cold to the touch. It used to open the lock to our family storage shed, the one at the back of the property. My husband had always said it was a place for things that mattered. I hadn't been back to that shed since the funeral. I made the drive the next morning. The property was mostly untouched. Quiet, full of dry grass and broken branches. The air smelled like sun on wood and distant smoke. I parked at the gate, walked the rest of the way in boots I thought I'd never wear again. The lock still worked. The shed groaned open like something exhaling after too long in the dark. Inside, it smelled of cedar and old paper. I had forgotten how many things we had saved over the years. Faded ribbons from county fairs, handwritten notes, tax folders, and then, toward the back, under a canvas cover, I found the small metal file box. Heavy, gray, still sealed tight. The key still fit. Inside, in addition to a few weathered photos and a plastic bag of old letters, there was a document sleeve marked in my husband's handwriting. Not legalese, just simple block letters, for Meredith only. I opened it slowly. What I found was the deed. Clear, legally sound, in my name. The entire 1,700-acre ranch, transferred to me 5 years before he passed. No clauses, no liens, no co-owners. There was also a letter. Just a few lines. Written with a pen I recognized, in the same steady print my husband used when he didn't want to be misunderstood. He wrote that he had seen the way Trevor looked at the land. Not with memory, but with calculation. He said he hoped Trevor would grow into the kind of man who asked before he took. But if he didn't, then this was my way out. My right to say no. I sat on the floor of that shed for what felt like hours. The wind rattled the roof gently. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just held the paper in my lap and breathed. It was the first time in a long time I remembered what it felt like to hold something that truly belonged to me. 2 days after I found the letter, I went back to the city. I didn't rush. I drove slower than usual, windows down, letting the cold air sting my face. I didn't play the radio. I needed to hear everything clearly. I had spent the night before sitting at the kitchen table, laying out every piece of paper from that box. The deed, the letter, the older tax returns. I even found a notarized statement from my husband's attorney confirming the transfer of property. Every document was dated. Every one of them legal. No room for doubt. No space for interpretation. I gathered them into a plain manila folder and slid it into my bag. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a weapon. It was proof. That was all. And for the first time in years, I was starting to realize I needed that more than I needed approval. I made an appointment the next morning with Delilah, the only person I knew who wouldn't ask questions I couldn't answer. She had been a lawyer for 3 decades and a friend for 4. We met at her small office in the corner of an old building downtown, still with the same bell on the door and a photo of her mother's farm behind her desk. Delilah read everything in silence, her brow furrowed, but she didn't interrupt. When she finished, she looked up at me and tapped the folder gently with her knuckles. Then she asked me one thing: what do you want to protect first, the land or yourself? I told her both. So we created the trust. It wasn't dramatic. No courtroom. No arguments. Just a notary, a few legal clauses, and a protective layer that made it clear, unless I was incapacitated and 2 independent doctors confirmed it, no one could make decisions about that land but me. Delilah added a few conditions of her own. She called them good habits. Automatic alerts if anyone tried to record a deed or apply for a permit. A quiet lawyer in Bend who would handle all correspondence. A clause that blocked Trevor or Blair from using my name in any business filings. The whole process took 3 days. I didn't tell Trevor. I didn't mention it in our family group chat. I didn't say a word to anyone. I just kept the folder. I still had it with me when I got home. I placed it on the top shelf of my closet. Not hidden, not displayed. Just where I could reach it if I needed to. The next time Trevor called, his voice was cheerful. He said he and Blair wanted to take me out again. He had some new renderings. He wanted to show me. Said he thought I'd be excited. I told him I'd check my calendar. Then I hung up, walked to the closet, opened the door, and looked at the folder for a long time. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel powerful either. I just felt ready. The restaurant was the same. Same barn-style lighting, same overpriced wine list, same polished wood tables arranged like they were waiting for important people. I arrived on time. Trevor and Blair were already seated. They stood up when they saw me, smiling as if we were just any family gathering for a casual Thursday night. Blair wore something pale and expensive. Trevor had on a new blazer, the kind he used to borrow from his father's closet in high school, but now it was tailored, modern, a size too tight, like he needed to look bigger than he was. They hugged me lightly, said it was good to see me. I nodded, sat down, and placed my napkin across my lap with the same precision I had used to fold his clothes for years. The menus were already closed on the table. Trevor leaned forward and said he had something exciting to show me. Out came a sleek portfolio. Matte black with gold embossed lettering. Blair gently slid it open and began flipping pages. The renderings were beautiful. Expansive pavilions with glass walls, meditation decks, elevated pathways winding through trees. Each page glowed with potential, with imagined serenity. They had named it Hallberg Hollow. Page after page of projected profits, visitor statistics, phase development. Blair spoke with confidence, her voice soft, her rhythm measured. She knew every number. Trevor chimed in occasionally with colored memories from his childhood that he wove into the narrative. It was polished, rehearsed, and not for me. They weren't showing me a dream. They were pitching a deal. When Blair reached the final page, there it was again. A signature line. My name already printed neatly below it. Trevor smiled. Said everything was in motion. Just one piece left. Just my blessing. I didn't say a word. Instead, I reached into my bag and took out a plain manila envelope. Nothing special. No branding. I placed it on the table and slid it toward them. Trevor looked confused. Blair kept her smile. Inside was a copy of the trust document. The clauses, the terms, the limitations. He read it page by page. No one spoke. Blair's expression shifted first. The crease between her brows appeared before her lips stopped smiling. She turned to Trevor, but he was already staring at the final clause. The one about medical verification. The one that made it clear no one would ever control that land unless I was unconscious and no longer breathing on my own. Trevor closed the folder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry. He simply placed both hands on the table, folded them, and exhaled through his nose. So that's that, he said quietly. Blair said nothing. I nodded once, gathered my napkin, and stood. I told them I was driving myself home. Outside, the air was colder than I remembered. The street was quiet. I walked to my car alone, started the engine, and let the silence wrap around me like a coat I had worn before. Only this time, it fit. The next morning, I made tea instead of coffee. Something softer, quieter. I didn't turn on the news, didn't check the weather, didn't reach for my phone. I sat in the kitchen and listened to the kettle whistle until it stopped on its own. The night before was still settling in. Not like a storm, but more like the ground after it's been tilled. I had said very little. Trevor even less. But something in that silence had sealed it. By mid-afternoon, I finally checked my phone. One message. No name attached, but I knew the number. It said, "You made things more difficult than they needed to be." That was all. No anger, no apology. Just disappointment. Wrapped in entitlement. A sentence that assumed my job was to make things easier for him. I put the phone down and left it on the counter. Later, I opened the hall closet. Inside was a box of old coats, scarves, a pair of leather gloves I hadn't worn in years. I reached behind them and pulled out a small set of keys tied together with faded red ribbon. One of those keys belonged to the cabin. We hadn't used it in nearly a decade. Not since the last Thanksgiving before my husband's health turned. It sat on the far end of the property, tucked near the woods where the trees grew thicker and the sun dipped earlier. I remembered the creak of the porch boards, the soft scent of pine that hung in the air year-round. I drove out the next day. The road was rough, overgrown in places, but the cabin still stood. A little tired, but upright. Like it had been waiting. I stepped inside. Dust floated in the light coming through the windows. The furniture was still there, worn but solid. I opened every drawer, every cabinet. Found a half-used notebook, a jar of dried lavender, an old flannel shirt folded neatly. In a basket. The cabin didn't need much. A good cleaning, a few repairs, a coat of paint. It was nothing like the resort Trevor had drawn up. And that was exactly why it felt right. That afternoon, I rolled up my sleeves and started sweeping. The sound of the broom against the wooden floor echoed like footsteps in a quiet church. I worked slowly, steadily, until the sun dipped behind. The tree line and the air turned cold again. I sat on the porch steps and watched the last light fade. There were no cars nearby, no messages waiting. Just the steady rhythm of wind through leaves. I had said what I needed to say. Not with words, but with choices. With actions. Trevor would go on. He would find another way, or maybe he wouldn't. But for once, I wasn't building anything for anyone else. The land was still mine. And now, so was the peace that came with it. The following week passed slowly. I spent the mornings airing out the cabin and the afternoons walking the trails I used to know by heart. The air smelled like damp bark and the last bits of summer. Every step I took felt like I was retracing a version of myself I had almost forgotten. One evening, as I was washing out the chipped enamel mugs we used to drink cocoa from, my phone buzzed again. I had almost stopped carrying it, but that night, I had left it on the windowsill, just in case. It was Trevor. His message was short. He said the bank had frozen a line of credit connected to a land appraisal. Said there was confusion. Said he hoped we could talk soon. I stared at the screen for a long time. The message wasn't warm. It wasn't cruel either. Just calculated. Like someone had lost a chess piece and couldn't figure out how. I didn't reply. The next day, he left a voicemail. His voice was calm, clipped, unusually careful. He talked around things. Mentioned my health, my comfort, the long drive back into town. He never once asked how I was. He never once asked if I was okay out here alone. I deleted the message. It was late October when Trevor showed up at the cabin. No warning, no message. Just the sound of tires crunching gravel and a car door closing too firmly. I had been in the shed, rinsing out glass jars, when I heard it. I didn't hurry. I dried my hands on my apron, placed the jars back on the shelf, and walked out into the yard. He was standing at the edge of the clearing. Same stance as always. Hands in his pockets. Jaw tight. Eyes darting around like he was deciding what version of himself to bring forward. I didn't invite him in. He didn't ask. We stood there in silence for a few seconds before he spoke. He said things hadn't been easy lately. That the financing for the project had fallen through. That Blair was staying with her sister for now. He didn't offer details. And I didn't ask for any. He said he had made mistakes. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said he blamed me. Not for the trust or the land, but for how he had turned out. For making him believe that things would always be there for him. That love meant sacrifice without limits. That family meant protection no matter the cost. I didn't respond right away. I looked at him standing there, a grown man still trying to make sense of the version of his life that didn't belong to him anymore. He looked tired. Not just in his face, but in the way he carried his own name. I told him I had done what I could with what I had. I told him I had tried to protect him for too long. That maybe the real mistake was never showing him how to carry disappointment without turning it into blame. He didn't like that. He paced, spoke louder, said I was rewriting the past. I stood still. I said this land had always asked for honesty. That it remembered footprints, even the ones that ran away. That everything he wanted had once been his for the taking. If only he had asked instead of assumed. His shoulders dropped. He didn't argue after that. Instead, he looked around at the cabin, the shed, the garden that was half asleep for the season. He didn't say it, but I could feel it, the distance between what he had planned and what was real. He asked if I needed anything before winter. I said I was fine. He nodded once, then turned and walked back to his car. When the engine started, I didn't look away. I waited until the sound disappeared down the road, then stepped back inside. There was nothing triumphant in the moment. No closure tied in a neat bow. Only stillness. And for the first time, that was enough. The first frost came early that year. I woke to find a thin layer of ice on the garden beds and a sharpness in the air that settled into my bones before I could get the kettle going. I moved slower that morning. Not because of age, but because the stillness felt earned. I pulled out the old composition book, the one I had been using to collect bits of thoughts, lists, half-formed reflections. I tore out a page, wrote my name at the top, not as a label, just as a reminder, and then I began writing the kind of letter I had never let myself write. I wrote to the version of me who had once believed that loving your child meant giving everything away. The woman who had swallowed silence over and over, thinking that peace was more valuable than truth. I told her she had done her best, but that she had deserved better. Not from Trevor. From herself. I told her it was not weakness to want to be seen. That self-respect was not pride. That disappointment did not have to turn into shame. I reminded her that she had built a life. A real one, with her hands, her time, her persistence. That the land had not bloomed because it was generous, but because she had been. And that no matter how quiet the world had become around her, her worth had never depended on applause. There were no tears when I finished. No dramatic pause. Just a small release in my chest, like air finally finding space it had been denied for too long. I folded the page and tucked it into the envelope where I had kept the deed. It sat there now beside old photos, letters from my husband, a dried petal from the first rose bush we planted together. Then I made tea, lit the fireplace, and sat down at the kitchen table with a kind of stillness that wasn't loneliness. It was something else. Something steadier. That afternoon, I opened the window to let in the wind. The trees had thinned, but a few stubborn leaves clung to their branches. Golden and dry, shaking but not ready to fall. I understood that feeling. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't try to fix it. The morning light filtered through the windows just right. It caught the edges of the old wooden table, traced soft shadows across the floorboards, and made the steam from my mug curl upward like a ribbon. Outside, the frost was lifting one patch of earth at a time. I stood barefoot on the porch, wrapped in my thick cardigan, watching the last of the leaves give in to the breeze. Nothing dramatic. Just the quiet shift of seasons. A natural letting go. No one called that day. No one stopped by. And I didn't mind. There was no calendar on the wall anymore. No plans circled in ink. But I knew what day it was. It was the first full year since I had stopped asking for permission to exist. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold soil. I closed my eyes and listened. No voices, no noise. Just the sound of birds in the distance and the slow exhale of a woman who had finally come home to herself. I wasn't waiting for anyone to say I was enough. I wasn't holding my breath for a reconciliation or an apology that might never come. I was standing on my own land, my own time, my own rhythm. The woman who had once been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's last priority now simply belonged to herself, and that was more than enough. If you've ever found yourself quietly fading into the background of your own life, I hope this story helped you feel seen. We all deserve to take up space. We all deserve to stand our ground. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it too. Sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply refusing to disappear.